One thing that Bill Belichick does is he makes practice extremely difficult. Like, he wets the balls because he wants people to try and fumble. He makes the grass really tall, so it's harder for people to run. Like, all the elements that you have within that practice are abnormal and things that you don't necessarily experience during a game, just so when you actually get to the game, it's a lot easier. So in context of a seller, if you're the BDR who gets a call script and you're sitting in a room and just like practicing on your own, and granted, sometimes we don't have someone to practice with, but if you're just practicing it on your own and trying to refine it, that's not a realistic situation, or even a situation that is going to really press you. So what I encourage my team to do is, like, when you're doing role plays, like, come at the person with the strongest objections.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Ernest Owusu, and Ernest is the Senior Director of Sales Development at 6 Sense. And in this episode, I talk with Ernest about, well, let's see. First of all, we talk about fatherhood. Ernest and his wife had triplets not that long ago, 2 boys and a girl. And you have to admit, that's a pretty crazy way to kick off a pandemic. We talk about football. Ernest was a star football player at Cal Berkeley and a former player in the NFL, and we talk about his unusual journey from professional football to professional sales. And I also ask him this question: will he let his sons play football? Well, you have to stick around to hear his answer on that. Now, sometimes people feel like the whole sports sales connection is overplayed, and perhaps sometimes it is, but however, I feel these are both performance-based professions, and there's a lot that carries over from one to the other. And Ernest shares ideas on some of the disciplines that he's carried over from his career in sports, including one I really love, is that you have to practice with the same intensity that you play. I love that idea. And we also exchange ideas on how to put that into practice. So stick around. Another very interesting conversation. Before we get to Ernest, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it with Ernest. Ernest, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, yeah, we finally made it happen.
Yeah. A lot of coordination, a lot of going back and forth, emails, calls, all that. Happy here.
Yeah. So, well, let's get to the most important thing first, which is that you and your wife had triplets recently.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. It's been quite the handful, to say the least.
I can imagine. So 2 boys and 1 girl.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yep.
And so the names are?
Yeah, sure. So Louis, Henry, and Ruthie.
Yeah.
So we like the whole like IE kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but classic names though. Louis, Henry, and Ruthie. I love it.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, are they identical?
Yeah, so the boys are identical. Obviously, the girl is not, but so they look very much alike. But it's funny because, like, even though they're still so young and they have a lot more to grow, we can very easily pick them apart. But I don't know how much longer it's going to be.
Well, so I guess that raises the question: is triplets? They probably all have distinct personalities. Then I imagine. Are you able to sort of, to your last point, sort that out? Yeah,
honestly, already, because I mean, they'll be 6 months in about 3 days, but you can very easily see kind of what they're probably going to be like. Ruthie, the girl, is like very calm, cerebral, very patient. Louis is probably the one who's going to be our fighter, the energetic one, and then Henry's just really happy all the time. So it's funny how you can kind of catch that early on, but we're already loving it.
Yeah, well, you're sort of learning something that usually parents don't learn until they have their second child, if they only have one the first time, which is that they just come out differently. Exactly. And I was telling a story with my son is my oldest, who actually is my producer. He just met him. And he was easy baby, right? Slept early. I mean, slept through the night early after just like 5-6 weeks, going all the way through. Happy-go-lucky. And we thought, gosh, when we have the next one, we'll do it the exact same way. So when his sister came, we said, we're just going to do it just the way we did it with Alec. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. Different person. Came out a different person. Well, it's having none of that.
It'd be great if we could predict it. We knew exactly what was going to be how it'd be, but that's not how it was.
All right. So you getting any sleep?
No, I'm not. But I will say, my wife and I have a pretty good. We're both athletes, and obviously we come with like a very regimented background. So we're both pretty aligned on a schedule to follow to make sure we're trying to get as much sleep as possible. But still, it's not quite happening the way I'd like it to be.
So, so you were a football player, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. So, what sport was your wife from?
Indoor volleyball. She's actually the head beach volleyball coach at Cal right now. So still very.
Aha.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wait, so beach volleyball is now a NCAA sport?
It is, yeah. So she started the program, I'd say maybe 6 years ago. So yeah, but it's an NCAA sport. It's one of the fastest growing right now.
Didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Hadn't kept track of that.
Yeah.
All right. So a question I usually ask guests is, what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself during the pandemic? But for you, I have a special version of that question, which is, what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself as a new father?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of us are like, even before this, a lot of us are just sprinting, like taking things as they were and kind of not taking the opportunity to look at things as they should be. And, as me, who was eventually going to be a new father, I knew that I was going to have to slow down a little bit because I wanted to spend more time with my family. And now that I'm home and I'm getting the opportunity to be a lot closer with them, I could literally jump out of this after this podcast, go out and just hold my kids. It's starting to make me realize how much more time I need to dedicate to my family, myself, just even outside of work. And that's probably a combination of all things COVID, but especially the fact that I'm just a new dad. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that's going to be like when all this is over, because a lot of these things that I have right now in terms of how much time I'm giving my family, how much I value it, I don't want to lose those after this. So.
Well, yeah. That was going to be my next question, is what happens when things start getting back to normal?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. But one thing I will say, though, is I was the kind of person who never, ever worked from home. I just never did it. I don't foresee myself having a structure where I don't do that at least once or twice a week after this, just because I'm starting to really realize how much time I get to spend with my family if I do that.
Well, I think it's one of the great things about this era. And I say that, very hesitantly. It's not, none of this is good, right? But in terms of a lesson people are learning, and I think companies are learning, is that, I think this blended, more flexible approach to work is a way you're going to get more out of your people. Giving people the flexibility to work remotely from 2 days a week and know that it's not the end of the world, right? I mean, in my wife's work, an academic institution resisted forever remote work for anybody. Oh, it just doesn't work. And then suddenly they were forced to have everybody remote. And it's like, oh, well, maybe it works.
Exactly.
Like, well, yeah. I mean, I think you're going to get more out of your employees, and not from an exploitative way, but just, people would just be more naturally productive because, to your point, they're feeling a little more balanced. They get a little more in touch with families. I think especially for people that travel, I always found that the hard part. I wanted to, because I traveled extensively for many, many years of my career, all around the world, constantly. And I'd get back from a trip and had to show up at the office the next day. And it's like, it would have been a great day to work from home. Now, we didn't really always at those times have the technology to do that, but it was still, I would have valued it. And I'm sure a lot of people are in your situation where it's like, I don't need to be remote all the time, but if I could have that opportunity to do it a couple of days a week, it'd be great. Yeah,
and it's going to be really interesting too, because we're going to have a very large sample size depending on when this thing finally finishes.
Yes,
like what actually happens when you have your entire workforce working remotely, if you get the opportunity to do so. So the business decisions that are going to happen after this, based upon that, are going to be really interesting to see. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, because people didn't sign up for remote work. This is one thing that I keep coming back to. It's like, okay, great. People have been hugely adaptable by and large, right? Across this country in all professions, we said, look, you got to work remotely. But it's not the way most people want to work. It's not the way I think most people are productive. Is they want to go to an office. They want to be with colleagues. They want to collaborate in person. They want to do these things that are more personal. And I think given the opportunity, if companies don't foreclose that just for the virtue of saving money on rent, which I think would be foolish, is do this blended thing.
Completely agree.
Yeah. Okay. So now, as I started touching on this, so for people who don't know, you were a star football player at Cal Berkeley.
Yes, I was. It was a lot of fun. Go Bears.
Well, as a loyal Stanford alum, I'm not sure I can really.
I won't hold it against you.
Not really sure I go with that "Go Bears" thing, but you guys have won at least one big game in the last 3 decades, right?
Well, I think we won the most recent one.
Okay, so two out of the last 20 years. Okay, good. All right, we had to do that. We had to get that out of the way. It's obligatory when Stanford person and Cal person talks together. Now, I do have to ask though: are you any relationship at all to Francis Owusu?
Interestingly enough, no, I don't, because the last name Owusu is by far one of the most common last names in the country that both our parents came from. And funny, his brother Chris, we were actually teammates together in Tampa Bay. So that was the first time I've actually had a teammate with the same last name as me. But no relationship. We're pretty close, Chris and I at least. But I get that all the time.
Now, well, I knew you weren't. I'd looked that up before. But you realize why I was asking about Francis, one of the greatest catches in college football history.
God. Yes, I remember that.
You remember the one, right? Against UCLA.
I definitely remember.
Yeah. I mean, for people who don't know, look it up on YouTube. Francis Owusu catch against UCLA for a touchdown where basically he's falling backwards, facing the direction the ball's coming from, the quarterback, has his arms around a defender, and he catches a ball behind the defender's back.
Should not have thought that.
It was amazing. All right.
Yeah.
So geeking out a little bit about that. But so you were a defensive end?
Yes, I was.
And all academic Pac-12.
I was. It was. That's honestly part of the reason why I chose Cal.
Of course. Great education.
Exactly.
I mean, we'll knock it. As a Stanford alum, I can knock it, but it is a fantastic education, yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And your major was?
Political economy. So, interestingly, I wanted to try and find, because I knew football wasn't always going to be a thing that I was going to have to retire eventually. So I saw that the mix between poli-sci and economics was something I was interested in, and that's kind of why I chose that.
Interesting. Well, I sort of think about that as I was doing research for this interview. I thought, well, that's about as relevant as my history degree, but good background for sales, I thought, because one of the real things that was stressed in the history degree was analytical thinking.
Exactly.
And so good grounding. So curious now, and I have a connection to sales for asking this, but so were you drafted by the pros?
No, I was not. So interestingly enough, I had the opportunity to do a ton of visits with teams. And the way the process goes is sometimes they call you and say they're going to draft you, but they actually don't because someone else becomes available. So I got a couple of those, I guess, ghost calls, if you want to call them. But at the end of the day, I ended up going undrafted. But one thing that people don't really realize is when you are kind of like in those later rounds, especially if you're eventually going to be a 6th or 7th rounder, it's actually better to go undrafted because you can choose your team as opposed to going somewhere that you want to go. So because I was kind of one of those fringe guys that was like 6th, 7th round, potentially like a preferred free agent, I had about 14 teams that I could have chosen to go to, and I chose the Vikings based upon their roster, the organization, etc.
Now, did you go to the combine?
I did my pro day, but my numbers, what I will say, had I gone, would have been top 3 almost on every single board, which is pretty cool to kind of hang my hat on.
Yeah. So did you do like that Wonderlic test and the in-depth interviews they do on all of that?
Yeah. So they hosted most of those at Cal, which was great. And the whole process is actually pretty crazy if you think about it. I didn't really realize it while I was going through it, but like the amount of analysis they're doing with like your personal life, your injuries, like everything, it's just kind of weird like how they're putting you through all of that. But yeah, I went through all of it. It was a blast. It was interesting in a lot of different ways, but I enjoyed it.
Well, I've written about this before because I'm always fascinated by this process that pros go through to evaluate pro football, to evaluate kids coming out of college for basically it's a job interview for your first job.
Exactly.
And there's this amazing rigor that's applied to it from this test and the interviews and so on. But interestingly, when you look at the statistics is high draft choices typically don't succeed very well.
Exactly.
And it's like, so what's that tell us about what we do to hire sales reps.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I have the answer to that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
Honestly, when you look at how people get drafted and how people select their preferred salesperson, people find comfort in tangible things. You find comfort in the fact that there's that one person who went to an Ivy League school, they went through sales training programs, they have 2 years worth of sales experience, because that typically is an indication of success. You have, in the NFL, it's if that one person ran a 4.3 and they went to Alabama and they have all the check boxes marked.
Yeah.
Then obviously that gives you a lot more comfortable. But the reality is there are a lot of really strong intangible qualities that people have that are typically a lot better indicators of success, but they're just a lot more difficult to measure. And that's the reason why, in my opinion, when you see sales hires or draft picks, that's why people make mistakes, because they're not as willing to be as comfortable with relying on the intangibles.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about my interview process for my first job. I mean, part of it was the sales manager really wanted to hire me.
Mm-hmm.
But the branch manager of this large computer company I was going to work for, who had the ultimate say, he took a little bit of convincing, because he was sort of the opposite. He was sort of suspicious of people from Stanford. He's like, you're all going to go to law school or business school, and then I'm not going to get any time from you, and I just want to hire someone from a local Cal State school because they do great, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was like, yeah, you can have all the things checked, like 4.3 from Alabama, and think, okay, that's a safer choice, but sometimes people, and to his credit, the branch manager said, yeah, there's more to it than that. Let's dig down deeper.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And honestly, with the teams that I hire, so we have our criteria that we look for like the perfect SDR, BDR candidate. And the reality is, like, we assess people for like the qualities of like how well they can talk, they can write, their business acumen, but a lot of like the main principles or characteristics are intangibles. And it's uncomfortable to try and assess that. And like people even kind of build out those assessment profiles that they use to kind of get a sense of what those qualities might be. But personally, I don't really care if you went to Stanford, if you went to another school, if you have the experience or not, like if you're whatever. As long as you possess those intangible qualities that we're looking for, those are the people that typically, in my opinion at least, lead to the success that you're expecting.
Yeah, I mean, it's this moment, hiring a new salesperson as their first job, or in your case, your first job was playing football. But in either case, it's a crapshoot, right? I mean, you're to your point about the intangibles, and which I agree with 100%, is that there's nothing very tangible, at least from a sales perspective, that you can hang your hat on. Yeah, somebody, worked in a retail store. I did, there's little things perhaps, but they tend not to translate. It's so much of it is gut feeling, which, some studies will say, well, don't rely on your gut instinct. There's one study that's showing people interviewing for jobs, and a sort of a control group, and one, looked at the resume, reviewed, and then had the people in for interviews. And the other was, we just hired people based on what we saw on their resume. And the ones that hired on the resume actually performed higher than those that they brought in an interview, because people did get their emotions involved. So like I said, it is this real crapshoot for entry level jobs, and I'm not sure. I think it'll always be that way. I mean, I'm not a big fan of personality assessments and some of those other things. But I mean, somebody asked me once what I thought my success record was with new hires and entry level jobs, and I don't know. I don't remember, but I'm sure is no better than anybody else.
I'd be curious to see that for a lot of people as well, and kind of how they're grading themselves based on what's actually happening.
The thing is, I remember the failures much more than the successes. I mean, I've hired people into jobs that were not entry-level jobs. In this case, the stories weren't about entry-level jobs, but people that were stellar performers at other companies came with high recommendations, people I knew and trusted, that showed up in the environment that we were in, and it just didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
and didn't work in a dramatic fashion. And this is, I think, the thing that makes it so hard about hiring, whether it's entry level or whatever, is just context is everything.
Exactly. One thing that I kind of try and do, and obviously this is a little bit easier said than done, is when I'm interviewing people, if there's that one thing that I'm just like really not okay with, and someone spends X amount of the interview like demonstrating that, in my head I'm like, okay, am I actually going to be able to accept the fact that this person is going to do that? Say 10% of the interview they're talking about like how they don't get along with their teammates or how they're not coachable. If someone's doing that with 10% of the time they're talking to me, they're going to do it with 10% of the time they're working in my company. So if I'm okay with that, then I'll take it. But if I'm not okay with it, I just absolutely cannot make a decision on that. That's always
well, I think you have to pay attention to the red flags. I mean, if you don't, what you're doing is settling, and every decision to some degree is a compromise, right? It's a big believer in this. They're all basically good enough decisions. But to your point is you have to decide which are the ones that you just can't accept. And it's true of relationships in general, right? I mean, you sort of have to put it in that context.
Exactly. Couldn't agree anymore.
All right. So I want to ask one last football related question before we go on. But so would you let your sons play football?
That's a great question. At the moment, no. And I will say, as a defensive end, because there are two on the field, this was literally my dream my entire life, to have two boys, same age, like same position, watching both at the same time. So it's kind of like cruel that I got this, but at the current moment, no. And a lot of that stems from the fact that when I first finished playing football, I worked with a company called Prasado, and part of the whole football environment is like very much of a warrior mentality where you kind of ignore things and don't embrace them for what they are. And honestly, even in the professional ranks,
like concussions and head injuries and things like that.
Exactly, yeah. But with concussions and head injuries, I did not pay any attention to it while I was playing because I saw it as one thing that was going to prevent me from playing. It's something that was going to slow me down. So when I had my first interview after finishing football, I had no sales experience. So my VP of sales was like, "Hey, I want you to sell me anything." Obviously, all I knew was football. So I went down that path of like doing research on helmets and concussions, and I was like, did I really just do that to myself for the past 15, 16 So it was very, very eye-opening to the point that, under the conditions that we have right now, I can't let my kids play, unfortunately. Not to say that things couldn't change where, protocol and practice and helmets can improve, but if it's like this, unfortunately, I can't do that.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of sports for kids. So swimming, for instance, very, very low head injury risk in swimming. Or volleyball, for instance. Yeah, exactly.
It'll be tough. I will say it'll be tough because obviously, I play, so they're going to want to play, but I just can't do that. Yeah.
Well, maybe they won't want to. I mean, that's the thing is, kids, they get their own interests. So, yeah. So you're out of football. You'd serve after Vikings, Tampa Bay, Canadian Football League. Did you actually play in the Canadian Football League?
Yeah, I did. And the CFL is it's like the rules are completely different. The field is different.
I love it.
It's a whole different game. And I had no exposure until I had the opportunity to go up there. But to your point, so I was with the Vikings, Buccaneers. Then I got really badly injured with the Buccaneers. Took a couple months off, tried getting back onto an NFL team. It didn't happen. So then I started going the Canadian football and even the arena route to try and get back onto a team. Just basically build my resume, show people that I wasn't hurt. And then honestly, at the end of the day, when it was like I realized that there was no way I was going to get back in because I was more of damaged goods, if you want to call it, to everyone else.
Yeah.
That's kind of when I made a decision to stop playing.
Interesting. So, I mean, there sort of was a moment, and I was wondering, was that like CFL, AFL, where it's just like, well, this isn't going to happen.
And it's funny because the last AFL team I was on, I was 26, turning 27. And though obviously I was still young, relatively young at that time, in football years, you're like middle-aged. And I was like, there's no way a middle-aged football player is going to get back onto a team with an injury. So I was like, I'm done. Yeah.
By the way, you still look incredibly young. I don't know if anybody's told you that, but
I think it's the lack of facial hair that grow. That's
okay. Because the first time we talked, I looked at you and said, "Oh, you probably had the same problem I did when I first got into sales. I looked like I was 12."
Yeah, I haven't quite been able to fight that off in due time.
So why sales?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I think a lot of, especially football players, professional football players, are always struggling trying to figure out what they want to do next. And for me, like I kind of hit that crossroads when I was done of like, all right, I don't want to be a coach because the only way to get fulfillment if I was doing the college level or in the NFL, but the hours as a coach, you're doing like 100 hours per week. It's a really demanding job. So I knew I didn't want to do that, but I wanted to find a way to take the skills that got me to the NFL and apply them to something else. And honestly, I just did a lot of talking to people after the fact. To talk to people in wealth management and finance and all these different industries. And all signs just started pointing towards sales because of kind of what I did as an athlete and kind of how I can parlay that into a successful career. And, honestly, I just took a big leap of faith based upon what research I'd done as well as recommendations from people. And I've been extremely happy ever since.
Was it sort of part of the mindset of thinking, well, I'd been an elite athlete, and sales is like one of those professions where the top performers are like elite athletes. And the path to get there oftentimes is like being an elite athlete.
100%. And I knew that, when I was an athlete, I worked really hard. I was very coachable. I was very process driven in terms of how I made myself better. And I already knew that before I even started thinking about what I was going to do next. So when I was talking to people about how I did that, all signs pointing towards sales because the great salespeople have the ability to do that. And it was just basically a no-brainer once I started to realize that.
So the disciplines then that you brought over from sports that helped you in sales, I mean, obviously you talked about preparation being one. Mm-hmm. Mindset obviously has to be part of it as well. Mm-hmm. Process along with that, I imagine, is also important.
Exactly, yeah. So I can even talk about the discipline thing. And I know people might think this is a little crazy, but when I was a BDR, I was on the West Coast working East Coast accounts. There's an industry best practice to call them in the morning. So I started something, which I actually still do to this day, of getting into the office at 5:30 in the morning because I wanted to put myself in the best situation to be successful. So sure. I have not deviated from that. And like I'm very well aware of the certain things that yield towards success. And once I kind of pull those out, I'm not going to change my process or steer away from that. So I think athletics allowed me to be extremely disciplined in that front. But one thing that's pretty cool that a lot of people don't really think about is just the process. To be a great athlete, I think I was even talking to a couple people about this a couple days ago, but most great athletes have like this one thing they do better than every single person else. And once you kind of identify what that one thing, it's like constantly optimizing it, making it better, tweaking it, learning how you can improve upon it. And a lot of my processes, once I have the framework built out, and this is probably my biggest strength as a seller, but like once I have the framework around what makes me good at a certain task or certain set of tasks, I outline it and just like poke it to death, trying to find anything I can do to make it better. And that's kind of how I've been able to succeed as a seller.
So besides showing up early, what's that one thing for you?
Besides showing up early, I mean, it's definitely, like I said, it's more the process. Like, even from when I was a BDR, it's like how I called people from the intro to your pitch to your close. Like I was ferociously always trying to find ways to improve just those tiny 3 segments. And the same thing as a seller in terms of how I'm motivating my team, in terms of how I'm tracking towards metrics, hitting my goals. Like once I understand what it takes to be great at those, I just keep going. So it's never really like it's more of just the overall process and looking for ways to improve. That's always made me great. It's not really that like I'm a great caller or I'm a great closer or anything like that. It's just like I'm very focused on the process all around.
Well, but it displays a lot, and I think this is an important lesson for sellers to learn, is that it sounds like what you've done, and this is absolutely what you need to do, is you analyzed sort of in advance, but you continually do it, is what do I need to do to really excel at this, right? And you said you put your process together. When you start, we all have started. We have no idea what we're doing when we get started, but if you sort of create that framework and say, look, I'm just going to keep improving and be consciously improving, not just sort of going through the motions and hope that I get better through experience, but I'm consciously going through it. Yeah, I think that's a huge separation from those people that consistently succeed versus those that just sort of get along.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to add to that too is it's really important to know why those things work for you. Because if you're the kind of person who's constantly searching for like that new thing or like a new strategy, new tactic, whatever it may be, and you're applying it to your process just because you're hearing that it's working, and you don't really know like how that applies to your process, that can be a problem in itself. So like there's definitely an aspect of selecting what you should take on versus what you shouldn't take on. But your ability to do that is contingent upon whether or not you actually understand how you're winning with that process. And I think at times, especially people that are new in their career, they struggle with that a little bit.
We said understand how you're winning. I would just modify that to align with what you said before, is understand why you're winning. Right. And I think that's really the why. And this is, to me, is the fundamental shortfall with most of the training we provide to sales reps, sellers in general, as sales managers even, is it's always about how to do things, but never why these things work. Right. And the fact is that, if I teach a class to somebody and I say, this is why this works, it may not work that way for everyone in the same way, but you give people the rationales within a context as to why these things are effective. Not just, we looked at some data and 26% of people reply to this or respond to this. It's like, no, this is, everything, to your point, everybody develops their own unique way of doing things. You just have to be thoughtful about it.
Exactly.
Well, you wrote something interesting. I liked recently. Is you said that you have to practice with the same intensity that you play. And I'm a played soccer in college, and huge soccer fan, and this is really one of the hallmarks of professional soccer, professional football in the Europe, is that everything's based on how intense you train.
Yep.
You have to train at 100%. You practice 100%. So how do you bring that into a sales context to say, we're going to practice with sort of game intensity?
Yeah, sure. So I can give you an example that I learned from while I was in the NFL, as well as what I teach on BDRs. So one thing that was really cool from the Patriots is, in NFL training camps, you get the opportunity to kind of do some cross-team practices. So I got to spend some time with the Patriots just for about a week or so, kind of watching their practices, practicing against them. One thing that Bill Belichick does is he makes practice extremely difficult. Like he wets the balls because he wants people to try and fumble. He makes the grass really tall, so it's harder for people to run. Like all the elements that you have within that practice are abnormal and things that you don't necessarily experience during a game, just so when you actually get to the game, it's a lot easier. So in context of a seller, like if you're the BDR who gets a call script and you're sitting in a room and just like, practicing on your own, and granted, sometimes we don't have someone to practice with, but if you're just practicing it on your own and trying to refine it, that's not a realistic situation or even a situation that is going to really press you. So what I encourage my team to do is like when you're doing role plays, like come at the person with the strongest objections, with anything possible that's going to throw them off, because when they get to the actual call, if they're prepared to handle even more difficult situations at times, then it'll be a lot easier for them to perform because they've kind of gone through already. But a lot of the practice that people do in terms of like their first calls, negotiation calls, alignment, whatever it may be, they're not really going live bullets. They're not really taking these calls on as like preparing to fail, if you say, and as a result of that, they kind of sell them short a little bit.
Well, I think that going along with that though too is, and I know in some sports, I presume it's true in football as well, is visualization before before a game, before a shot in golf or before a shot in basketball or whatever, is so important. And people don't do that enough in sales. So I agree with you 100% on the role play intensity, but I think part of it too is in call preparation is you have to take a few seconds. And I know it's hard because people think, oh God, I'm under such pressure to make my 50 calls, but yeah, I'd rather you made 30 really good calls as opposed to 50 calls, but play through all the what ifs and if thens that you can envision that will happen in this call based on what you know about this account, especially if it's not a first call and you've got some background, how it's going to play out, what are all the variables that could occur. And you can do that in just a few minutes, just sort of think through that. To me, that's part of this practicing with intensity as well, is you have to bring this you have to be deliberate and thoughtful about sales. And this is I think part of the lot of sellers miss is this is really a thinking person's profession.
100%. And actually, I'll definitely take that away because that was a practice that I had in football, where I'd sit down the night before, day of, and just kind of visualize myself making plays. And I did it a little bit when I was in SDR, BDR, but I've definitely gone away from that. So I appreciate the call on that, because I'm definitely going to take it back to my team and share it with them.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Yeah, just give me the credit.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the other thing that I thought was interesting, and that you'd written recently, which I liked, is you talked about people publicly shaming salespeople. Mm-hmm. You wrote about this on LinkedIn. So tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah, it's funny how, even with LinkedIn, even introducing the stories recently,
right?
It's funny how LinkedIn is evolving, and
it's Facebook.
It's basically Facebook. It's slowly turned into a networking system, but now it is literally, what am I doing outside of work and work? That's social media in its full, not just with work. But I'm starting to see that people are posting things in the hopes of gaining attention while putting people down, and there's absolutely no room for that. I don't understand how or why, and even at certain times, people are doing these in inaccurate scenarios, just for the sake of gaining attention, for calling someone out for doing something wrong. And like, the reason why I have a problem with that, in particular with salespeople, because you're supposed to be failing in sales. Like, you have to fail. If you're not failing, you're not growing. So if something's happening on social media where we're making it okay for people to shame people for literally doing what they're supposed to be doing and failing fast, that does not align with what it takes to be a successful salesperson. It also makes it really difficult for those earlier salespeople to have the confidence to keep going forward. And I just don't understand why that has become an accepted norm on social media. It's just completely counterproductive to what salespeople need to be successful.
Yeah, I think there's a corollary to that goes on too, which is that, and I've seen this recently, is calling out on LinkedIn, and I'll put this in air quotes, sales experts mm-hmm. for supposedly giving bad advice. Mm-hmm. And my perspective on sales is that, if there's 7 billion people in the world, there's 7 billion different ways to sell. Mm-hmm. And who's to judge what's good or bad? Because, I obviously have an audience and I talk about what I think people should do, but I know it doesn't work for 100% of the people. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it doesn't make it bad advice. It's great advice for some people, and it's not going to work for others. And I think that's, in sales, we have to get past this idea that there are absolutes and that there are recipes, because there are no one recipe that works for every seller.
Exactly.
You have to make your own.
And that's what it all comes down to, is because people in sales, people just find comfort in data. They find comfort in knowing there's a silver bullet behind everything. And like, if there was a silver bullet, if there was an exact way to do it every single time, then we would not be unique as sellers. We'd be robots. You wouldn't need sellers, because there's a solution that's in hand that everyone can use and just repackage, and it works every single time. You would not need sellers at the scale that you need right now. The reality is, you need that dynamic aspect. You need that creativity that sometimes can't be replicated based upon different scenarios or whatever it may be. And people kind of lose sight of that because they're looking for a way to just find comfort in the fact that if I do X, Y, and Z, no matter what, I'll win, which, at least for what I see in the near future of sales, that will not be the case.
Yeah, well, no, it won't be. And yes, there is this tendency, I think, in newer sellers these days, because of the technology we have, to say, there must be this data tells me this is the way to do it. And the trouble with so much of the data that's published about sales is it's completely without context. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so somebody can say, look, we've analyzed a bazillion phone calls, and if you say these 3 words at this particular point, you're going to increase your ability to, probability of winning. I mean, there's a list of 20 variables that affect that, at least.
Yep. You're calling, have you spoken before?
Is a male seller, a female seller, are they selling to a male, selling to a female? I mean, just got to go down the list, right?
Exactly.
And so, I love what you're saying, because I think it's a good lesson for people to learn. It's just that you got to be your own person. At all times, got to be your own person.
Yeah, and we try and coach that. So one thing that we focus on here is we have like a really good onboarding path where we teach really strong fundamentals. But part of our process is to really identify like what you as an individual seller are strong at. Because the things that I focus on as a BDR, SDR, my other top performers may or may not be focused on that. But like, part of being a great seller is like really understanding the fundamentals and knowing your identity and marching towards that path. And honestly, the people that are constantly searching, it's more so because they just haven't identified what their actual identity is, as opposed to the ones who already do know that they're winning and producing great ways to win because they already know who they are.
Yeah, well, I agree. And I think the only caution I'd add to that is just that changes as you mature and grow. I couldn't have explained why I was successful as a 24-year-old seller or as a 26-year-old sales manager. It probably wasn't until I was probably my late 40s that I really had a good handle on that. But it kept changing because the environments I was working in kept changing. But as long as you're trying to be self-aware about it, and I think that's really the critical thing, is as long as you're trying to be thoughtful and self-aware about how you sell, where your deficiencies are, what you need to improve on and constantly work on, then that's the path you need to go down.
Completely agree.
All right, Ernest, we have to jump off. It's been fantastic. So if people wanted to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Sure thing. So you can find me on LinkedIn, very active on LinkedIn. So my name is Ernest Owusu. Go search me there. You will also find me on Twitter, the Ernest Owusu. The reason I say the Ernest Owusu is because you go into Twitter and search it, you will see a ton of Ernest Owusu. Trust me. So I have to claim my stake.
Yeah, I'm glad you got that one. I tried to get the Andy Paul. I didn't get it. I got real Andy Paul, but yes, yeah. It's always surprising how many people have your name. Exactly.
All
right, well, good. Well, Ernest, it's been a pleasure, and we'll make sure we do this again.
I would love to do so, and it's great talking to you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of this program, and I want to thank my guest, Ernest Owusu, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or review, let us know how we're doing, well, we'd appreciate that. And you can do that all on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is finished. Thank you for your help, and thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.